The dockyard worker hammers another wooden plug at 1400 hours on April 10th, 1942. Chief Petty Officer Albert Mason stands on scaffolding along HMS Penelope's starboard side, counting the holes he still needs to plug before the cruiser can sail. The ship is in Malta's Grand Harbor for emergency repairs after 3 months of continuous bombardment. Her hull is perforated with over 450 holes from bomb fragments, each ranging from fist-size to large enough to put a head through. Mason and his team have been working for 6 days cutting wooden plugs from whatever timber's available. Furniture, packing crates, building material, hammering them into the holes and caulking them with anything that might seal. Tar, canvas, even old rags. The result looks absurd. A warship covered in wooden patches like enormous pincushion, earning her the nickname Pepper Pot from crew who joke that she looks like kitchen utensil after being shot with shotgun. But the makeshift repairs will work in 2 weeks. Penelope will sail from Malta carrying over 2,000 wooden plugs in her hull, will reach Gibraltar without sinking, will receive proper repairs, and will return to Mediterranean operations, proving that sometimes survival is not about sophisticated engineering, but about determination to keep floating regardless of how ridiculous the ship looks. The Pepper Pot will demonstrate that battle damage is relative concept when the alternative to wooden plugs is abandoning ship, that improvisation can accomplish what proper facilities cannot when those facilities do not exist, and that the ugliest ship still afloat is more valuable than pristine vessel at the bottom. HMS Penelope was an Arethusa-class light cruiser commissioned in 1936 for fleet operations and trade protection. The Arethusa-class specifications reflected interwar treaty limitations on cruiser construction. Displacement: 5,270 tons standard, 6,715 tons full load. Length: 506 feet. Beam: 51 feet. Draft: 14 feet 4 inches. The ships were designed to maximum allowable size within treaty restrictions while maintaining sufficient speed and armament for light cruiser roles. Armament: 6 6-inch guns and 3 twin turrets, 8 4-inch anti-aircraft guns, 8.5-inch torpedo tubes. The 6-inch guns were main battery for engaging surface targets. The 4-inch guns provided anti-aircraft defense, increasingly important as air power became dominant threat. The torpedoes were standard cruiser armament, though rarely used in practice. Additional light anti-aircraft weapons, 20mm Oerlikon and .5-inch machine guns, were added as war progressed. Power plant: 4 Parsons geared turbines producing 64,000 horsepower. Maximum speed: 32.5 knots. Range: 5,300 nautical miles at 14 knots. The speed was adequate for fleet operations and convoy escort. The range allowed extended patrols without constant refueling. Armor protection was minimal, typical for light cruisers. 2-inch belt, 1-inch deck over magazines. The armor could resist destroyer shells and shell fragments, but not heavy cruiser or battleship fire. The design prioritized speed and range over protection, reflecting the light cruiser role of scouting, raiding, and screening rather than line combat. Crew: approximately 500 officers and men. The crew operated the ship's weapons, machinery, and systems while maintaining round-the-clock watches during combat operations. The accommodation was cramped, typical for warships of the era, with minimal comfort and limited space for off-duty crew. Penelope served with the Mediterranean fleet from commissioning through early war operations. She participated in convoy escorts, fleet actions, and bombardment missions. The Mediterranean theater was intense. Italian Navy contested British control. German and Italian aircraft attacked shipping, and British forces maintained supply lines to Malta and Egypt despite heavy opposition. Malta's strategic position made it target for sustained Axis attack. The island sat astride Axis supply lines to North Africa, providing base for British submarines, aircraft, and surface ships that attacked Rommel's supply convoys. Axis forces attempted to neutralize Malta through air bombardment and blockade, while British forces struggled to keep the island supplied and operational. Penelope arrived at Malta in December 1941 for operations against Axis convoys. The plan was to use Malta-based cruisers and destroyers to intercept supply ships heading to Libya. But Malta itself was under siege. German and Italian aircraft bombed the island continuously. The harbor and dockyard were primary targets. Destroying ships at anchor would eliminate the threat they posed to Axis convoys. The bombardment began in earnest in January 1942 and intensified through March and April. German Luftwaffe units from Sicily flew hundreds of sorties daily, dropping bombs on harbor, airfields, and urban areas. The bombing was precise and sustained, designed to destroy Malta's defensive capability and force surrender or abandonment. Penelope was caught in harbor during the peak bombardment period. On March 26, 1942, she was in dry dock for routine maintenance when air raid began. Bombs fell around the dry dock. One bomb hit nearby, the explosion showering the ship with fragments. The fragments were small, shrapnel from bomb casing, but they perforated the thin hull plating. Dozens of holes appeared across the hull, most small, but some large enough to compromise watertight integrity. The damage assessment showed over 50 holes from that single near miss, but the raids continued. On April 1st, another near miss added more holes. On April 4th, direct hit on nearby warehouse sent debris and fragments across the ship. By April 10th, damage control teams counted over 450 separate holes in the hull plating, most below the waterline or at the waterline where they would flood when the ship was afloat. The situation was critical. Malta's dockyard facilities were damaged by bombing. Proper steel plate repairs required welding equipment, replacement plate, and time. None were available. The dockyard workers' improvised solution: wooden plugs, cut wooden cylinders to fit each hole, hammer them in from outside, caulk them with whatever sealing material was available, reinforce from inside with bracing. The method was crude but effective. The work required 6 days of continuous effort. Workers scavenged wood from damaged buildings, broken furniture, packing crates. Each plug was cut by hand to approximate size, hammered into place, trimmed flush, and sealed. The larger holes required compound plugs, multiple pieces fitted together and caulked heavily. Some holes required metal backing plates secured with bolts through the wooden plugs. The crew participated in repairs. Sailors with carpentry skills worked alongside dockyard workers. Others fetched materials, prepared caulking compounds, or assisted with scaffolding and access. The work continued through air raids. When sirens sounded, workers took cover, then returned to continue plugging holes. The urgency was total. Every day in Malta meant exposure to more bombing. By April 16th, the temporary repairs were complete. Penelope looked absurd. Over 2,000 wooden plugs of various sizes covered her hull like scales. The caulking was uneven. The patches were mismatched colors, and the overall appearance suggested ship held together by desperation rather than engineering. The crew nicknamed her HMS Pepperpot. The name spreading through the fleet as photographs showed the bizarre patchwork hull. But the repairs worked. When the dry dock was flooded and Penelope floated, the wooden plugs held. Some minor seepage occurred, but pumps handled it easily. The ship was seaworthy enough for voyage to Gibraltar, where proper repairs could be performed. On April 27th, Penelope departed Malta as part of convoy escorted to relative safety. The voyage to Gibraltar tested the makeshift repairs. The Mediterranean in April could be rough. The ship's motion flexed the hull, stressing the wooden plugs. Some plugs worked loose and required replacement at sea. Crew members went over the side in rope harnesses to hammer new plugs into holes that had opened. The pumps ran continuously, removing water that seeped through imperfect seals. But Penelope completed the voyage without serious flooding. At Gibraltar, proper repairs began. The wooden plugs were removed. The holes were surveyed, and steel plates were welded over the damaged areas. The repairs took several weeks but resulted in structurally sound hull. The ship returned to combat operations in June 1942, participating in convoy escorts and fleet actions through remainder of the war. The Pepperpot nickname persisted despite the proper repairs. Penelope was always HMS Pepperpot to those who had seen her wooden-plugged hull or heard the story. The nickname was badge of honor. The ship had survived Malta siege, had kept floating despite damage that would have sunk lesser vessels, and had done so through improvisation and determination. The broader context was Malta's desperate situation in spring 1942. The island was under siege. Supplies were critically low, and the bombing was intended to force surrender. Ships like Penelope, damaged but operational, represented British determination to hold Malta regardless of cost. Every ship that survived and escaped was victory against Axis strategy of attrition. The wooden plug repairs demonstrated British resourcefulness under pressure. Proper facilities would have repaired Penelope with steel plate in climate-controlled dry dock with skilled welders and quality materials. Malta had none of that. Malta had scavenged wood, improvising workers, and determination to keep ships operational. The solution was crude but adequate. Wooden plugs kept the ship afloat long enough to reach proper facilities. The comparison to modern damage control shows how far naval engineering has advanced. Contemporary warships use damage control systems designed for battle damage. Watertight compartments, damage control teams with specialized equipment, redundant systems allowing function despite casualties. But the principle remains. Keep the ship floating and fighting regardless of damage. Penelope's wooden plugs were a primitive version of same principle, applied with materials at hand because sophisticated solutions were unavailable. The human element was critical. The dockyard workers and ship's crew, who spent 6 days cutting and hammering thousands of wooden plugs, understood they were performing makeshift repairs that would barely suffice. But barely sufficing was sufficient when alternative was abandoning ship. Their work kept Penelope operational, allowed her to escape Malta, and enabled her eventual return to combat effectiveness. The strategic impact of saving Penelope was marginal but meaningful. One light cruiser did not change the Mediterranean campaign's outcome, but every operational ship mattered when forces were limited and demands were continuous. Penelope's survival meant one more cruiser available for convoy escort, one more ship that could engage Italian forces, one more asset that complicated Axis planning. The symbolic impact exceeded the tactical value. Penelope's escape from Malta demonstrated that British forces would not abandon the island. The damaged ships would be repaired and returned to service, and that resourcefulness could overcome material limitations. The wooden-plugged hull was physical manifestation of British determination to continue fighting regardless of circumstances. Post-war, Penelope continued service briefly before being sold for scrap in 1946. Her war service had been intense. Mediterranean operations, Arctic convoys, D-Day support, years of continuous combat operations. The ship was worn out, her machinery was tired, and post-war budget constraints made retention uneconomical. She was broken up in 1947. No complete record documents exactly how many holes were plugged or how many wooden plugs were used. The commonly cited figure of over 2,000 plugs is based on crew recollections and contemporary reports. The actual number might have been higher or lower, but the order of magnitude is correct. The ship was thoroughly perforated and required extensive improvised repair. Photographs of Penelope with wooden plugs are rare. The repairs were performed in Malta under siege conditions when photography was restricted. A few images exist showing the patched hull, documenting the bizarre appearance that earned the nickname. These photographs are historical artifacts demonstrating the extremes of improvised damage control under combat conditions. The fate of HMS Penelope's crew through the war varied. Some transferred to other ships. Others remained aboard through multiple operations. Some were killed in action or died from disease or accidents. The crew who were aboard during the Malta siege and wooden plug repairs remembered that period as exemplifying the desperation and determination of the Mediterranean campaign. Fighting while being bombed, repairing ships with scavenged materials, and continuing operations despite conditions that should have forced withdrawal. At 1400 hours on April 10th, 1942, Chief Petty Officer Mason hammered another wooden plug into another hole in Penelope's hull, because the alternative was abandoning the ship, and Malta's defenders could not afford to lose operational vessels. The plug held, as did the thousands of others, keeping Penelope afloat through voyage to Gibraltar and eventual return to proper combat capability. HMS Penelope, the pepperpot cruiser covered in wooden plugs, demonstrated that battle damage is manageable when resources and determination combine to keep ships operational, that improvised repairs using scavenged materials can accomplish what sophisticated facilities cannot when those facilities are unavailable, and that sometimes the most important engineering is not elegant or proper, but merely sufficient to keep floating until proper repairs become possible. The ship that looked like kitchen utensil proved that appearance means nothing when function is maintained. That ridiculous-looking repairs are superior to pristine appearance at the bottom, and that the ugliest ship still afloat is combat asset, while the most beautiful ship sunk is total loss. Penelope sailed from Malta carrying thousands of wooden plugs because wooden plugs were available when steel plate was not, demonstrating that in warfare, survival often depends not on optimal solutions, but on using whatever works when optimal is impossible and adequate is sufficient if it keeps you alive long enough to fight again.